A janitor at JFK was overheard speaking perfect French, then German, then Arabic. But what the airport's CEO uncovered next, it didn't just change Miguel's life, it shook the entire terminal. It was just after 6 a.m. at JFK International Airport. The sky outside was a washed-out grey, the kind that made fluorescent lights feel harsher and time feel slower. Travelers shuffled in half-silence, dragging luggage and sleep behind them. Edward Callahan, the airport's CEO, adjusted his tie with a sigh as he walked through Terminal 4. 59 years old, greying at the temples, tall and lean, he looked like someone who hadn't slept a full night in years. His job was to keep the chaos moving smoothly, not to get lost in the details, and certainly not to notice janitors. But something stopped him. Near the entrance of the women's restroom, he heard voices, not raised, not loud, but different. A woman, confused, flustered, and a man answering her in perfect, graceful French. Edward slowed his step, then stood still. The voice didn't belong to a passenger. It came from a man in a dark green janitor uniform, mop in hand, rubber gloves on. He was gesturing gently, calmly helping the woman find her way. She smiled, touched her heart, and thanked him in French. The janitor nodded, replied with a warm, "Bonne journée, madame," and returned to his cleaning. Edward blinked, then frowned. Not many janitors speak fluent French, and that accent, it wasn't learned from tapes or apps. It was lived. He walked away but found himself glancing back. The man looked to be in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. Salt and pepper hair tucked under a cap, skin sun-worn, eyes focused. There was something precise in the way he cleaned, like every motion mattered, like he was trying to restore more than just the floor. Edward couldn't stop thinking about it. He passed by again an hour later. The same janitor was now by the main lobby, mopping near gate B12. And this time, it was different again. A couple stood beside him, lost and arguing softly in German. Without hesitation, the janitor looked up, spoke to them, in German, calm, assured. The couple's eyes lit up. Relief poured over their faces. He pointed, gestured, smiled. Edward stood frozen, then walked away quickly, pretending he hadn't seen anything. This wasn't just chance. Something about this man didn't fit the uniform he wore. Something about him didn't belong in silence. Edward Callahan had overseen JFK for over a decade. He knew every flight pattern, every contractor, every crack in the marble floor of Terminal 4. But that janitor, that man with the mop and the multilingual tongue, was something he couldn't file away neatly. The next morning, Edward arrived earlier than usual. He didn't check emails. He didn't meet with the operations team. Instead, he wandered, quietly. And there he was again, the janitor. This time at a family assistance booth, kneeling beside a crying child. The mother, panicked, couldn't understand the announcement system. She was speaking Arabic. Edward recognized just enough to know it wasn't a dialect he could fake. But the janitor, he leaned down, spoke gently, clearly. His words in Arabic floated like music. The child stopped crying. The mother covered her mouth, stunned, then nodded, eyes brimming with gratitude. Edward stood behind a column, watching, listening. Something stirred in his chest, something between curiosity and unease. Who was this man? Later that afternoon, Edward sat in his office on the 32nd floor, staring at the security monitor. He rewound footage from the past week, watching the janitor again and again. Each time, a different interaction. Each time, a different language. French, German, Arabic, Japanese, Portuguese, at least 6, maybe more. His name, according to the badge, was Miguel Santos, hired through a third-party cleaning contractor. No red flags, no special notes. Just another invisible figure in the airport machinery. Edward wasn't easily impressed. But something about Miguel got under his skin. There was depth behind those quiet eyes, precision in his movements, a kind of calm he hadn't seen in a long time. Not in this business of rushing and reacting, he picked up the phone. "Get me the cleaning supervisor," he said. "Now." A few hours later in the staff lounge, Edward waited. Miguel entered, hesitant, his hands still smelling faintly of bleach. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Miguel asked, his voice steady but cautious. Edward gestured to the seat across from him. "Please, sit. You've caught my attention." Miguel said nothing, his expression unreadable. Edward leaned in. "I've been in this airport for 17 years. I've seen thousands of employees, but I've never seen a janitor translate German, Arabic, and Japanese in the span of 2 days. Care to explain?" Miguel shrugged. "I speak a few languages." "A few?" "9, sir." Edward blinked. "9?" Miguel gave a faint nod. "Fluently, others conversationally." The silence hung thick between them. Edward's mind raced, curiosity rising like a tide. "You could be anywhere, working for embassies, airlines, international NGOs, but you're here, mopping floors." Miguel looked away, his gaze drifting toward the window, where planes lifted off into the late afternoon sky. "I've been places," he said softly. "But this place, it's quiet. People don't ask questions. They just appreciate a clean floor." There was no arrogance in his tone, no hint of bitterness, just a quiet acceptance that unsettled Edward more than any complaint ever had. And something told him this story was only beginning. Word spreads quietly in an airport, not through announcements, but through sideways glances, whispered conversations, the subtle shift of curiosity. By the end of that week, Miguel Santos was no longer just the janitor with the green uniform. Among staff, he had become the man who speaks 9 languages. It started small. A gate agent swore she heard him speak Mandarin to a distressed traveler who'd missed her connection. Then a baggage handler watched him calm a frantic Russian grandmother, helping her find her son's arrival gate. Each time the same result, no fanfare, no lingering. Miguel helped, then returned to his mop like nothing had happened. Edward Callahan watched it unfold like a slow-moving mystery. He kept his distance for now, but he listened. The night security guard mentioned Miguel had corrected a Spanish translation on a safety sign. The lost and found clerk swore Miguel read a handwritten note in Korean and translated it without pause. 9 languages. That number echoed in Edward's head like an unanswered riddle. One afternoon, as a soft rain tapped against the terminal windows, Edward found himself at the terminal cafe. Not for coffee, he hated the bitter airport blend, but because he'd heard Miguel sometimes stop there during his break. Sure enough, there he was, alone at a corner table, stirring tea, no phone, no book, just stillness. Edward approached slowly. "Mind if I join you?" Miguel looked up, surprised but not startled. "Of course." Edward sat across from him, adjusting his jacket like armor. "I've been thinking about what you said, about liking the quiet. But I have to be honest, Miguel. I don't believe that's the whole story." Miguel smiled faintly. "It rarely is." Edward leaned in, voice low. "You could be anywhere. What keeps you here, pushing a mop down hallways filled with noise?" Miguel set down his cup. "Noise on the outside, silence on the inside. That's what I came here for." There was something old in his eyes. Not age, but experience. A life packed away behind layers of modesty. Edward tapped a finger on the table. "If I gave you a different job, one that used your skills, would you take it?" Miguel looked out the window, where rain blurred the tarmac lights. "Not without understanding why you're offering." "Because you don't belong where you are," Edward said. "And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it as a truth." Miguel chuckled softly. "You sound like someone who's used to fixing systems. But I'm not a system." "No," Edward admitted. You're a story, and I don't think you've finished telling it yet. Miguel's expression didn't change, but his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, flickered with something like pain or memory. You'd be surprised, he said quietly, how many stories people stop telling when no one wants to listen. For a moment, neither man spoke. The rain tapped on. The coffee cooled. Then, almost as an afterthought, Miguel added, I was an interpreter a long time ago. Edward's heart skipped. For whom? Miguel stood slowly. That's the part people stopped listening to. He nodded politely, tossed his cup and walked away, leaving behind not answers, but something more powerful. Mystery. 2 days later, Miguel received a formal request to report to the executive office. It wasn't phrased as a command, but in a place like JFK, when the CEO asks to see you, you don't say no. He arrived 15 minutes early, still in his janitor uniform, boots scuffed, hands clean. The receptionist offered him coffee. He declined. Edward was behind his glass desk, overlooking the airfield. As Miguel stepped in, Edward stood and walked to greet him personally, something he rarely did. Thank you for coming, Edward said. Miguel nodded. You asked. I came. They sat. The silence was thick, not uncomfortable but careful, like a tightrope between two men who didn't yet trust each other but wanted to. I want to understand, Edward said. I don't need everything, just help me see how someone like you ends up here. Miguel exhaled slowly. People always assume it was failure. Edward shook his head. Not failure, but choice or consequence. Miguel tilted his head. Maybe both. He leaned forward, folding his hands over his knees. I was born in Lisbon, moved to the US when I was 9. Languages came easy, maybe too easy. I studied linguistics, cultural anthropology, got recruited by the State Department out of grad school. I spent 2 decades in airports, embassies, border zones, refugee camps. I wasn't translating words. I was translating survival. Edward listened, absorbing every word. I worked in Sudan, Syria, Colombia. I helped negotiate hostage releases. I whispered into ears at peace talks. I held the hands of mothers who'd lost everything, just so they could hear that someone, somewhere, still saw them. His voice didn't crack, not once. But Edward could feel it, the tremor buried underneath. So what happened? He asked softly. Miguel looked down. Sometimes the worst part of telling the truth is realizing how few people want to hear it. Edward waited, gave space. I uncovered a ring of officials funneling aid money into weapons deals, Miguel finally said. They told me to shut up. I didn't. Then everything changed. He paused, then continued, almost mechanically. I lost my security clearance. My passport was revoked. My contract was terminated without cause. My wife... He cleared his throat. She couldn't take the pressure. She left, took our daughter. A silence thicker than before settled between them. I tried to fight, Miguel said, for years, but the truth costs, and eventually you run out of things to pay with. Edward stared at him, not with pity, but with something closer to awe. So you came here? Miguel nodded. I needed somewhere quiet, where I could still help, just in smaller ways. And 9 languages, Edward murmured. You sweep floors, and you save lives, in whispers. Miguel met his eyes. It's not the language that saves them, it's being seen. Edward sat back, breath caught in his chest. He didn't know what he had expected, but it wasn't this. You know, he said after a long pause, this airport is filled with people who feel invisible, staff, passengers, everyone just passing through. And yet, you stop, you notice. Miguel gave the faintest smile. I don't know how to live any other way. Edward stood. I don't know where this goes, Miguel. But I'd like to find out. Would you be open to a new role? Something different? Miguel hesitated, then quietly, maybe, but I don't want a promotion to fix me. I've spent years learning how to be okay where I am. Edward extended a hand. Then let's not fix anything. Let's just listen. Miguel shook it, firm, solid. And for the first time in a very long time, something in both of them shifted. Not forward, not back, just open. After their conversation, Edward couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his Manhattan apartment, city lights flickering like restless thoughts across the ceiling. Miguel's story looped in his mind, not just the facts, but the way he told them. Calm, controlled. Like a man who had spent years locking his past behind doors no one dared to open. But Edward wasn't just curious now, he was invested. The next morning he called in a favor. An old friend from Homeland Security, someone who owed him after a botched customs audit a few years back. I need you to look into someone. Quietly. Miguel Santos? The friend said after a pause. Edward, you sure you want to open that file? That only made Edward more certain. What arrived later that afternoon wasn't a full dossier, but it was enough to stir the waters. A scanned photo of Miguel, 15 years younger, standing in a United Nations tent surrounded by children. Another speaking into a microphone at a conflict resolution summit in Geneva. Headlines blurred and buried. Interpreter accuses aid officials of corruption. Whistleblower disappears after controversy. Then, silence. A sudden stop in 2010. No trace, no follow-ups, like he had vanished. Edward sat back in his chair, stunned. The man cleaning his airport was once at the center of international negotiations, a name whispered in diplomatic circles. Then, nothing. It wasn't just disgrace. It was erasure. He looked again at the last photo. Miguel holding a young girl in his arms, maybe 4 years old, curly hair tied in a ribbon. The caption read, "With daughter Sophia, 2008. Edward stared at her face. Something tightened in his chest. Later that week, he summoned his deputy director, a woman named Carol, who had been with the airport longer than him. Do you remember when Miguel started working here? Carol nodded. 12 years ago. Quiet guy, no trouble, never late, never takes sick days. He's invisible, but in the best way. Anyone ever ask where he came from? Carol shrugged. He told HR he used to work overseas. Said he wanted something simple. We assumed he was running from something. We just didn't know what. Edward felt a strange mix of guilt and respect. For years, he'd walked past Miguel like he was part of the furniture. Now, he saw a man who had once carried entire rooms with his voice and chosen silence as his refuge. The next day, as the sun set across the airfield, Edward walked the terminal alone. He found Miguel near baggage claim, carefully wiping down a bench. Miguel, he turned. Sir, Edward held out the photo, the one with the little girl. Miguel's eyes flickered, just a second, but it was enough. Sophia, he whispered. Edward waited. I haven't seen her in 9 years, Miguel said, voice soft as the hum of the escalator. She lives with her mother in Seattle. She was 5 the last time I held her. Edward didn't press, didn't intrude, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything Miguel had never said. Everything he'd buried beneath layers of work, humility, and forgotten languages. You gave up the world, Edward finally said. Miguel nodded. To protect her. And now? Miguel looked around at the travelers rushing by, the families reuniting, the lives intersecting for minutes at a time. Now I keep the floor clean, he said, so no one else slips. Edward saw it then, the quiet grace of a man who'd traded power for purpose, not out of fear, but out of love. He left Miguel to his work, but something inside him had changed. This story was no longer just about talent wasted. It was about a man who had chosen to be forgotten and was slowly being remembered. 2 weeks passed. Miguel returned to his quiet routine, mop in hand, badge clipped to his chest, never drawing attention unless someone needed help. But beneath that calm exterior, something had shifted. He felt it in the way people looked at him now, not with pity, with curiosity, respect, as if the silence he had built his world around was beginning to echo. Then, on a rainy Wednesday morning, something unusual happened. A package arrived at the executive office. No return address, just a manila envelope sealed with thick tape marked for Edward Callahan, personal. Edward opened it slowly, cautiously. Inside were several documents, faded photos, and a note handwritten in tight, deliberate print. He won't tell you the full truth. Maybe he can't, but someone should. He saved more lives than you'll ever count. I owe mine to him. Use this with care. No name, no signature. Edward spread the contents on his desk. His breath caught. There were reports, stamped, declassified, some in English, others in French and Arabic, testimonies from refugee camps, letters of commendation from NGOs, a transcript from a closed-door tribunal in 2010, names redacted, but one name repeated again and again, Miguel Santos. He wasn't just an interpreter. He was a mediator in hostage rescues in Nigeria, a crisis liaison in South Sudan, and the only civilian who managed to de-escalate a violent standoff in a Yemeni refugee corridor, simply by speaking each side's language with compassion. And then, the scandal. He had discovered that a high-ranking official in an international aid agency was rerouting food and medical shipments to private militias. Miguel had reported it through official channels, but the channels were already corrupted. They silenced him, stripped his credentials, erased his work, and left him to vanish. Edward stared at a photo, Miguel standing between two child soldiers, their weapons lowered, tears running down one boy's face. Miguel was speaking, his hand on the child's shoulder, peace caught in a frame. He leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. The man who had scrubbed gum off the floor last night had once walked into gunfire to stop a massacre, and now he cleaned Terminal 4. That afternoon, Edward took the file to HR, quietly. He had it sealed in the private executive archive, far from public eyes. He wasn't ready to confront Miguel yet. Not with this. Not until he understood what to do with a story so enormous, and a man so humble. Instead, he called in a trusted journalist he knew, someone from the old days who owed him a favor. "I need you to find out where his daughter is," Edward said. "Her name is Sophia, last known in Seattle." The journalist hesitated. "You trying to write a comeback story?" "No," Edward said. "I'm trying to help a man remember who he was, and who still loves him." That night, Edward walked the terminal alone. He saw Miguel by the international arrivals gate, helping an elderly Korean couple find a taxi. No one clapped, no one recorded it, no spotlight, just another day. But Edward now saw what Miguel had spent years hiding, not just grief or guilt, purpose. And beneath it, a man who had once believed the world could be saved with words, and still quietly did. It was nearly midnight when Edward found him again. The airport had quieted. The hum of engines, the occasional crackle of the intercom, the low murmur of cleaning crews, it all blended into a lullaby of the in-between. It was the hour of ghosts, where the past feels closer than it should. Miguel was wiping down a row of metal benches near gate D19. Alone, as always. Edward approached slowly, holding the manila folder in his hand. "Miguel." He turned. "Sir." Edward didn't say anything right away. He simply handed him the envelope. Miguel looked down at it, confused, then slowly opened it. He saw the photos, the testimonies, the picture of the two boys with rifles, and the note. His breath caught. "How did you—" "Someone sent it," Edward said. "Someone who remembers." Miguel stood still for a long time, the weight of the folder heavier than anything he'd carried all day. "I thought it was all gone," he murmured. "Burned, buried, forgotten." It wasn't. Miguel sat down, almost collapsing onto the bench. His eyes were wet, but no tears fell. He gripped the folder like a man holding a piece of himself he never thought he'd see again. Edward sat beside him, quiet, waiting. "I gave everything to that life," Miguel said finally. "Every bit of hope, every second of faith. I believed words could stop bullets, that if you just spoke the right phrase in the right language, people would listen." He shook his head. "But when they turned on me, when they covered it up, no one spoke for me. No one translated my grief, not even my wife. She said I was obsessed, that I couldn't let go." "What did you say?" Edward asked gently. "I didn't," Miguel whispered. "That was the problem. I just stopped talking." Silence. "I thought if I disappeared, the pain would too, but it doesn't. It just settles into the bones." Edward nodded. "I read what you did. It wasn't small. It wasn't forgettable." Miguel looked up. "Then why does it feel like it never mattered?" Edward paused, then leaned forward. "Because you've never let yourself be seen again. You hid. Out of pain, yes, but also out of guilt. You felt like you failed everyone, including yourself." Miguel looked away. "But here's the truth," Edward continued. "You didn't fail. You were failed by systems, by cowards, by the ones who couldn't carry the truth you spoke." He reached into his coat and pulled out a single photo. Sophia. "I found her." Miguel's eyes widened. "She's 20 now, studying linguistics. She speaks 4 languages, wants to work with refugees." Miguel's hands trembled as he took the photo. His thumb brushed over her smile like it might vanish if he wasn't gentle enough. "She remembers you," Edward said. "She said she still dreams in Portuguese. She wants to see you." Miguel broke. The tears came fast and silent, as if they had waited too long to fall. "I don't deserve her," he whispered. "She decides that," Edward replied. "Not your past." They sat there in silence, not the kind that isolates, but the kind that heals. Then Edward spoke again. "There's a conference here next week, dozens of international delegates. We need someone to interpret, not just languages, but people." Miguel looked up, startled. "You want me? I want the man who once stood between war and peace and chose to speak." Miguel took a deep breath, closed his eyes. Then, with the quiet strength of someone reclaiming himself, he said, "I'll do it, but I keep the mop." Edward smiled. "That's fine, but you won't be invisible anymore." The morning of the conference arrived like a hush before a storm. JFK's Terminal 4, usually abuzz with delayed flights and coffee-fueled complaints, had taken on a new energy. Flags from 12 nations hung from the rafters. Translators bustled with earpieces. Security hovered with subtle tension. In the center of it all, a modest podium had been set up near Gate 18. Rows of white folding chairs formed an impromptu stage. The media was limited. This wasn't meant to be a spectacle, just a summit on humanitarian cooperation in global transit zones. And at 10:45 a.m., the keynote interpreter, a janitor named Miguel Santos, stepped to the front. He wore the same green uniform, but his back was straighter now, his eyes clearer, and when he adjusted the microphone, the room quieted. Not because of title or authority, but something deeper. Presence. Edward stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching with a mix of pride and nerves. He didn't know exactly what Miguel would say. He'd offered him a speechwriter. Miguel declined. "I've spoken enough lines written by other people," he'd said. "Today, I speak mine." Miguel looked at the gathered delegates, suits from 6 continents, many already glancing at their phones. Then he began. "In airports," he said, "no one stays long. We are all passing through. But it's here, in these in-between places, that we see who we really are." The audience began to shift in their seats, eyes lifted. I spent decades interpreting the words of others, translating pain, fear, hope, across borders, across bombs. I believed if people just understood each other, peace would follow. He paused. I was wrong. A murmur rippled through the room. Understanding doesn't lead to peace. Courage does. Courage to listen, to speak when silence is safe, to tell the truth when truth is dangerous. His voice held steady, calm, but every word struck like a bell in a quiet church. I was erased for speaking up, stripped of my title, my name, my family. I chose exile, not in a desert, but in this terminal, among strangers, among the overlooked. He looked out at the crowd and directly into the camera lenses. And here I learned something greater than politics, greater than language. I learned that humanity happens in small moments, a mother's cry, a child's confusion, a lost old man who needs a map more than a medal. Miguel took a breath. And today, I'm not here to interpret your words. I'm here to ask, what will you choose to see, the uniforms or the people inside them, the titles or the truth? A long silence followed. Then one delegate stood, then another and another. Applause began softly, unsure, then swelling into something louder, not thunderous, but real, earned. Edward felt his throat tighten. In that moment, Miguel wasn't a janitor. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't a forgotten man. He was what he had always been, a voice that made people listen. Afterward, people approached him in waves. A translator from Nairobi hugged him. A delegate from Spain offered a business card. A tearful woman from Brazil whispered, "My father was like you." He never spoke again. Miguel thanked them all, humbly, quietly. And when the terminal emptied out, he walked to the janitor's closet, hung up his mop, and smiled. It wasn't the end of the road. It was the return of a man who had never really left. 2 weeks after the conference, a new plaque appeared beside the staff break room. Multilingual Assistance Office, coordinated by M. Santos. It was a small room, barely wider than a storage closet, tucked behind the main terminal corridor. But inside, it buzzed with quiet miracles. Miguel now wore a badge that read Cultural Liaison Officer, but everyone still called him Mr. Santos. He'd set up a table, 2 chairs and a row of language maps on the wall, each with pins showing where passengers came from that day. He didn't carry a mop anymore, but his old janitor's uniform hung behind the door, pressed and neat, like a reminder or a vow. Every day, Miguel helped travelers who had no one else to speak for them. A Nigerian woman whose luggage was lost and couldn't read the claim forms. A Japanese grandfather looking for his connecting gate. A Guatemalan teen trying to reach her aunt in New Jersey. He listened, translated, calmed, but more than anything, he saw them. Edward often passed by the small office and paused at the door. Sometimes he watched Miguel switch from Russian to Italian in the same breath. Sometimes he just stood there, marveling at the grace with which Miguel moved through chaos, not controlling it, but softening its edges. And then, one crisp morning, Sophia arrived. She stood at the arrival's gate, suitcase in hand, her dark hair tied back in a ribbon like the one in the photo Edward had shown Miguel weeks before. Miguel froze when he saw her. Sophia didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply walked up to him and said, in Portuguese, "Pai, posso te ouvir agora?" "Dad, can I listen to you now?" Miguel nodded. She stepped forward and hugged him, not tightly, not desperately, but like someone reclaiming something lost but never broken. Edward turned away then, giving them space. Later, Miguel brought her to the small office. "This is where I live now," he said. Sophia smiled. "It's not big." Miguel looked around. "No, but it reaches far." He began mentoring others, staff members who spoke second languages, teaching them not just grammar, but empathy. He started an internal program called Voices Between Gates, training janitors, clerks, and ground staff in cultural communication. Not because they needed titles, but because they were often the first to help when someone was lost. Travelers began requesting Miguel by name, and though he now sat at meetings and advised on international affairs for the terminal, he never moved offices. He stayed in the little room behind the corridor, next to the break room where no one important had ever lingered. Until now. He became the airport's heart, not the busiest, not the loudest, but the place where pain met patience, and strangers became people again. It was a Tuesday morning like any other. Flights were delayed. Coffee spilled. Announcements echoed over tired travelers. The rhythm of the airport moved on, relentless and indifferent. But in one quiet corridor near Terminal 4, something rare was happening. A boy from Mumbai, traveling alone for the first time, clutched his boarding pass with trembling hands. A janitor noticed, spoke to him gently in Hindi, walked him to the right gate. That janitor's name was Carlos. He'd been trained by Miguel. In the next terminal, an elderly woman from Poland grew confused by the self-check-in kiosks. A young ground agent named Melissa stepped in, speaking to her in perfect Polish, then offered to walk her to security. Melissa had once shadowed Miguel during his language workshops. And outside the multilingual assistance office, a new sign had been installed. "Here, everyone is understood." Miguel sat inside, reviewing a list of languages spoken by the incoming class of seasonal staff. His glasses perched low on his nose, his hands steady. Sophia sat across from him, now interning at the airport's outreach program. She watched him, sometimes taking notes, sometimes just smiling. There were still scars in Miguel's story, still questions, still nights when silence crept in and old wounds whispered doubts. But he no longer hid from his past. He lived alongside it. Sometimes travelers would ask who he was. Some assumed he had always worked there. Others guessed he was once a professor or a priest. Miguel would smile and say, "I'm just someone who's been in a lot of places and stayed to clean up what I could." And people listened. One evening, Edward invited Miguel to speak at a staff appreciation event. He resisted at first. But when he stepped onto the makeshift stage, surrounded by people from every department, custodians, pilots, ticket agents, mechanics, he didn't read from a script. He looked out and said, "We are not the ones people come here to see. We are not the destination. We are the pause between where they've been and where they're going. But that pause, it matters. We matter. Every act of kindness, every word spoken in someone's language is a lifeline." A hush fell. Then applause, not polite but full, from the gut. Afterward, someone asked him if he missed his old life. Miguel thought for a moment. "I don't miss being important," he said. "I miss being useful. But here, I've found a new kind of usefulness. Quiet, consistent, human." He still cleaned sometimes. Not because he had to, but because he liked the rhythm, the simplicity, the clarity. And once a week, he walked the length of the terminal at closing hour, not to supervise, just to remember. Every language spoken, every person passed, every life briefly seen. And in those quiet walks, in the low hum of humanity on the move, Miguel Santos felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Have you ever met someone who changed your life in a place where you least expected it? Maybe it was at an airport. Maybe it was someone who simply saw you. We'd love to hear your story in the comments. Your words matter, just like Miguel's. If this story touched your heart, consider leaving a super thanks to support more stories like this. It helps us keep the channel alive and brings these moments to more people around the world. And don't forget, subscribe, hit the bell, and check out the next story waiting for you on the screen now. Trust us, it's another one you won't want to miss. Thank you for being here.